This is our second video on a 3-video series on how to rebuild a KTM 2-stroke bottom end. If you need help with this assembly, be sure and check out our first video. Hey guys, so we just got all the bearings pulled out of our cases, we cleaned them up real nice, and we actually installed all new transmission bearings and crank bearings. If you need help with that, be sure and check out our video. We also pulled apart our transmission, inspected everything, the shift forks, shift drum, everything. If you need help, be sure and check out that video. So next what we're gonna do is we're gonna install some seals, and then we're gonna get this motor put back together.
Whoa. Where's Steve?
Oh, Steve had a small crash into a tree on his dirt bike, so I'm gonna be filling in. Okay, so again, to start off with, we're gonna install the seals and get ready to put this motor back together. In order to install these seals, I always take just a little bit of grease, make sure I lubricate just the outside of the seal and just a little bit on the sealing surface. Once I have those lubed up, I'll install the seal, and I'm using the Tusk bearing and seal driver to install this. And the main thing we need to watch for is to keep the seal flush as it goes down. We don't want it to tilt one way or the other. So using the installer and a hammer, we can lightly tap on it. And we want to keep going until the seal is flush with the face of the case. Okay, as we can see there, that seal's pretty flush. We still have nice movement of the bearing. That seal's ready to go. And now we're going to install the rest of the seals just like we did. Now that we have all the seals installed on our crankcases, we're going to install the right side crankcase onto our stand. The right side crankcase as if we were sitting on the bike. So here we can see there's the opening for the piston. The crankshaft will sit inside. Kickstarters on this side. This is going to be our right side crankcase. So next we're going to install an O-ring onto the right side of the crankshaft. What I like to do, I like to grease up that O-ring a little bit before I install it. Helps it slide on just a little bit easier, and it'll actually go right onto that second lip, right against the wall. Once we have that installed, we're actually going to heat up the crank bearing that we have in this crankcase. That way it'll expand and allow us to slip this crank in all the way. And as we're heating this bearing up, KTM recommends that we heat it up to about 100 degrees Celsius, which is about 212 degrees Fahrenheit. So not incredibly hot, but warm enough to make it expand. Okay, now that we've got that heated up, it is going to be hot to the touch, so we have to be careful. But quickly, we should install the right side of the crankshaft. It's the side we just installed the O-ring on. Stick it in. If we press in, it should slide in all the way, just like that. It should be all the way seated. Now that we have the crankshaft installed in our right side crankcase, we're going to install the transmission gears. To do that, we're going to take a little bit of assembly lube, and we're actually going to grease up the inner races of the bearings they're going to sit in. They're going to be these top 2 bearings in this crankcase. Next, we will take the main shaft, and just the main shaft. We're going to leave out the shift forks and the other items right now, and we'll lube up the area where it's going to ride on the bearing. Next, we'll take the counter shaft, and again, lube up the area where it's going to be riding inside the bearing. And for ease of installation, I'm actually going to rotate this crankcase perfectly up and down. When it's all the way upside down, washers tend to fall out of place, gears fall out, it's a mess. So we'll take our main shaft and our counter shaft and align them. We'll align the gears, make sure they're in place. Now that they're in place, we can slowly push these into the bearings. They should slide in pretty easy because we have lubed them up. And once they are all the way in, we can spin them and allow them to move freely. Okay, and now that we have the transmission into the crankcase, we're going to rotate this back up, helps prevent them from falling out. And as we're getting ready to install these shift forks, we need to find the proper alignment or proper placement for them. There are 3 different shift forks, and they all have a very specific location. If you didn't keep them together or in place as you took them apart, we're going to help show you how or where they go. The first shift fork is going to be the outer countershaft shift fork. This shift fork is the only shift fork that has these two detents on it right off the shaft. Now the inner countershaft shift fork on the shorter jaw is actually going to have a concave face. And the one shift fork that goes on the main shaft is going to look pretty similar to the inside countershaft shift fork. However, the shorter jaw piece, it does not have a concave face. It actually is perfectly flat. So this is going to be the proper alignment for these shift forks as we install them. Okay, so now that we have the location of these shift forks in place, we need to find the proper orientation. When we install these, each of these shift forks have these little pins. These pins need to face in towards each other. So I'm going to install these and show you where they go. So the first shift fork we're going to install is the inside countershaft shift fork. This shift fork, again, on the shorter jaw has the concave face. This one we're going to install right after that second gear on the countershaft. So we're going to the big gear, smaller gear, and right after that smaller gear goes this shift fork. It should slide right into place, and the hole on this shift fork should line up with the hole in the case. The next shift fork is the outer countershaft shift fork. Again, this is the one with the two detents on the outside, and that's going to be on the outside. This one, from the top gear, it's going to be 1 gear, 2 gear, and in between those, and in between the second and third gear. The last shift fork we're going to install is the single shift fork on the main shaft. This one, again on the shorter jaw, has the flat top. So we're going to install that, and that one will install from the bottom. We'll go 1 gear, 2 gear, and then the shift fork. And again, once we have those into place, we need to make sure all of these pins are facing inside towards the center bearing. Now that we have the shift forks installed in the motor, we need to take our shift drum and disassemble it if we have it installed. We need to take out this Allen bolt and remove this outer portion. That will be installed later on in the build. So we'd take the shift drum, and the part that was threaded into the outer part, we're actually going to take that and install that into the center bearing. As a note, we want to keep this raised section right here in an upward direction. It's going to help with install. And another thing that's going to help with install is actually raising the stand up till it's flat. That way nothing's going to fall out of place. So we'll be installing the shift drum with this side down into the crankcase. There are 4 different grooves on the shift drum. This one will not be used right now. We're going to install them from the bottom up to the top. And if you have any questions, just make sure that each of these grooves has a little hill to clear. So installing this with this raised part in an upward direction, we're going to slide that down into the bearing. A little tool that I'm going to use for installation that really helps is this little angled pick. It helps grab the shift forks, and I'm able to lift and control them a little bit better. So I'm going to stick that down into the main shaft shift fork. This is the easiest one to start with, I found. After that, the other ones just kind of fall into place. I'm going to take that shift fork, raise it up a little bit, and slide it into place. The next shift fork I'm going to do is that inside countershaft shift fork. This one is going to be sliding into the bottom groove. Again, this pick is really nice. I can slide it down in there. I can lift up on the shift fork and slide it into position. And the last shift fork is this outside shift fork on the countershaft. It basically falls right into position. Okay, now that we have the shift fork pegs into the shift drum, we're going to keep this motor on its side. That way none of the shift forks are going to fall out. Next thing we need to do is install these rods into the shift forks. And again, before installation, we're going to put just a little bit of assembly lube on the shaft. Make sure it's nice and greased up before we install it. Now we can install the shaft through the 2 shift forks and into the case. Okay, now that we have that longer rod placed into the counter shaft shift forks, we're going to take this smaller rod and place in the main shaft shift fork. We'll do the same thing on this main shaft shift fork, slide it through the shift fork and make sure it sits into the right crankcase. And this is the rod that has a spring on each side of it. Okay, now that we have all of our transmission pieces into place, it's a great idea to screw on the outer part of the shift drum onto the outer part of this right crankcase and run through all the gears. We want to make sure everything's aligned properly and that everything's going to run smoothly when we get the two case halves together. Now that we're ready to run through all the gears, it's going to be a little bit difficult. You may need a friend to help you, but we need to make sure these shift rods stay inside the right crankcase. They need to stay planted, and we need to run through the gears by twisting the shift drum and allowing the gears to turn. So we're just about ready to lay down our second crankcase half. So there's a few things we're going to make sure of. We're going to make sure we have our dowel pins in there, make sure our mating surfaces are clean, and before we lay down our gasket, we're actually going to lightly grease the surface of this in order for the gasket to seal a little bit better and come apart a little easier on the next time we rebuild it. Now that we have that mating surface lightly greased, we're going to lay down our gasket, make sure it clears the dowel pins nicely, and make sure it lays flat against the entire sealing surface. Now that we have that gasket sitting nicely on that sealing surface, there are a few things to take note. This gasket, it is in the way of the connecting rod and also the reed valve opening. So once we get that second case half on, that's when I will be cutting these away and making sure it's nice and clean. So a little prep work before we install the second case half. I want to make sure these seals are nice and greased up. I don't want them to tear when we install the crankcase. And then I'll also flip it around and install some assembly lube on the inner races of the bearings. And also we have these mounting tabs and holes that our shift fork rods are actually going to sit into. So I'll make sure we put a little bit of assembly lube on those. One thing I will also do is stick a little bit of lube on that main bearing. And the last thing we do before we install this crank half is grease up that mating surface. Now we're ready to install the second case half. So we need to make sure the gasket's all lined up with all the bolt holes, make sure they're on the dowel pins nicely. Then we can slowly place the crankcase onto the second half. We need to be careful to make sure all the pins and everything align properly. Now that we have the second half of the crankcase in place, we are going to take some M6 by 40 bolts and we're going to place them into the crankcase and thread them in by hand. Once we have them all threaded in by hand, we are then going to tighten them down, and that's going to suck our cases together. Now that we have those bolts hand tight into the crankcase, KTM recommends that we torque them to 7.4 foot-pounds or about 88.8 inch-pounds. So we'll go ahead and do that. They don't specify how to torque them, but we recommend torquing them in a crisscross fashion, making sure that the case halves come together nicely. Now that we have those M6 by 40 bolts torqued, KTM says to put the M6 by 55 bolts into the two locations just behind the reed valve opening. We'll hand tighten those, and then KTM again recommends that we torque those to 7.4 foot-pounds or 88.8 inch-pounds. And last, we have this M6 by 60 bolt. It's going to go right here behind the counter shaft. We'll hand tighten that and again torque it to 7.4 foot-pounds or 88.8 inch-pounds. Okay, now that we have the two crank halves together, we're going to clean up these gaskets around the connecting rod and the reed valve opening. So I'm going to take a razor blade and cut those away now. Make sure not to compromise the sealing surface at all. We need to keep those nice. Now that we have the gasket cleaned up and the mating surface is nice and clean, we're going to cycle through the motor. We're going to turn the crankshaft, make sure it spins freely. We're also going to cycle through all the gears, make sure nothing is binding. Okay, now that we know that everything spins freely and nothing is binding, we're going to take some clean rags and I'm going to install them around the base of the connecting rod, and also I'm going to install one in the reed valve opening. I just don't want any dirt or debris falling into the crankshaft and ruining our whole motor. At this point, we're ready to install the flywheel rotor. So we're going to grease up the cone shape area on this crankshaft because this is a press fit. And another tip I like is to grease up the woodruff key. This helps hold it in place while we install the rotor. Now, taking my flywheel, I'm also gonna grease up the mating surface. And as I slide this on, I need to ensure that the woodruff key mates up with the slot in the rotor. Now that we have that slid onto place, it's time for us to torque this down. So I'm using the Tusk flywheel holder tool. I'm going to tighten that down onto the rotor. I'm actually going to take a rag, place it in between the handle and the countershaft. That way I can rest the handle against the countershaft, and that will allow me to torque this nut to 44.3 pounds and it won't slip. So then I'll install the lock washer and the nut. I'll hand tighten this nut. And now that I have that hand tight, again, I'll torque to 44.3 pounds. Now that we have that torqued, we can remove the rag, undo the tool, and that's good to go. Okay, now that we have the rotor all the way installed, we're gonna rotate the motor around and we're gonna work on the other side, installing all the gears. That's the end of our second video in a 3-part series on how to rebuild a KTM 2-stroke bottom end. Make sure and watch the third video in this series for the final steps of reassembly.